thanks to this week's sponsor, War Thunder. More on them later. The US has, by far, the largest and most capable network of satellites and space capabilities of any nation on Earth. But little is known about the true extent of its capability and reach. The US government releases budget documents detailing the number of aircraft it's buying, or even the exact number of small arms rounds. But when it comes to satellites, almost nothing. In fact, sometimes it's so classified that each agency will deny it's even their satellite that is launching, let alone state the type or its purpose. And that's just simply due to the high levels of secrecy around it, as it's most often utilized by intelligence agencies. But through declassified documents, some knowledge of orbital mechanics and electrical engineering, and especially last year's Pentagon leaks, we can gain some insight into just what they're capable of. And it's pretty incredible. Some of the leaked documents indicate the ability to detect missile launches and explosions, intercept communications from nearly anywhere on Earth, and even identify the location of virtually every squad or soldier with a radio. And first, real quick, our sponsor. War Thunder is the most comprehensive military vehicle combat game ever made, and it's available for free on PC and consoles. They have thousands of armored fighting vehicles like tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, tank destroyers, as well as fighter jets, helicopters, and ships, and from 10 different nations. There's a ton of content with this free-to-play game. And I also play the game, and I love the detailed and sophisticated damage modeling. Each vehicle will model damage not just by some hitbox, but by each component. Engines, fuel, weapons, crew, and so on. And they all take into account different types of armor, weapon types, and warheads, and more, all to be as accurate and realistic as possible. And that's what I love about the game. But some people might not be as nerdy as me. And for them, they have other game modes, like arcade, for some faster paced matches. So go on and download and install the game right now. It's free. New players, and players who haven't played in 6 months, will also receive a massive bonus pack. That includes multiple premium vehicles, the exclusive vehicle decorator Eagle of Valor, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of a premium account. But all that's available only for a limited time, so don't miss it. Click the link down in the description or in the pinned comment. The US has a long, uninterrupted history of launching military satellites. Everything from communication satellites, to early warning satellites, to detect nuclear launches, to imaging satellites. Today, they have a massive number, including GPS and communication satellites enabling real-time guidance and communications between military units anywhere on Earth. In fact, many of the drones flying missions in the Middle East have been directed and coordinated in real time from over 10,000 kilometers away in Nevada. But for the sake of time, we're just going to look at what are most typically referred to as reconnaissance satellites. For this sake, those include the typical imaging satellites that most people think of, but also other forms such as radar and infrared imaging, as well as SIGINT or signals intelligence satellites and early warning satellites. Early warning satellites started out pretty simple. They basically just had a primitive infrared sensor that would detect a heat signature from a ballistic missile as it launched. And they suffered from the technology of the day, at times even mistaking sunlight reflecting off the clouds and ocean as a missile launch. But since then, they've evolved into satellites with capabilities that reach far beyond simply detecting nuclear launches. The newer space-based infrared system can detect much smaller and shorter-range missile launches, like Iskander, and even track them in real time, and provide not just the precise impact point, but also relay it to missile defenses to try to intercept it. The latest series of satellites being launched are the beginnings of networks that will take it a whole step further to detect and fully track hypersonic weapons and assist in shooting them down. This includes the 2 HBTSS satellites that were launched just in February, as well as 33 Space Development Agency satellites of a planned 1,000 satellite constellation by 2027. Also, speaking of the current space-based infrared system, they likely also carried a payload for the Trumpet ELINT, or Electronic Intelligence Satellites. ELINT is just a subset of SIGINT, or Signals Intelligence. Signals Intelligence has been used for a long time, going back to World War II and even before. But one of the most significant stories, at least that we know of, comes from Vietnam. During the first 4 months of Operation Linebacker, a huge number of US aircraft were being shot down by North Vietnamese MiG-21s. The problem was that the US lacked radar coverage that deep over enemy territory. The North Vietnamese had plenty of radar coverage and were able to detect US aircraft and then radio their MiG-21s to go to the locations and intercept them. So basically, US aircraft would repeatedly fly in and be ambushed. The US was aware of this, but there wasn't much they could do as the ground control radios used to vector those MiG-21s was line of sight only. The only way they could reliably detect it was with a U-2 spy plane flying at high altitude with a SIGINT payload. A team was quickly put together and they developed a method to have the U-2 relay communications in real time to a control center codenamed T-Ball. With this information, the US now had virtually the entire air picture the North Vietnamese had, since they broadcasted it to their MiGs. Now, the US could ambush them. The ratio of kills to losses went from 1-to-1 to 4-to-1 by the end. The capabilities SIGINT gave became clear, and the US invested heavily after. Today, virtually every aircraft and satellite has some form of SIGINT sensor on board. And these US SIGINT satellites are by far the largest satellites in space. Trumpet, in particular, is believed to have a diameter of 150 meters. The large size is to pick up and detect even the most faint signals. While at least 4, possibly 6 Trumpet satellites focused on ELINT, or electronic intelligence, which detects signals from radars to map their locations, for example, there's also Mentor, sometimes referred to as Advanced Orion. These are more focused on comment, or communications intelligence, and can even ID and locate individual cell phones and possibly Wi-Fi. The most recent Mentor was launched just 1 month ago in April. It's also the source of some of the data in the Pentagon leaks last year. In those, which I won't show, but there are maps showing the ability to locate individual radios and even communications between the highest levels of governments. To be fair, SIGINT also includes other means, not just EM waves in the air, such as tapping fiber optic cables to monitor the entire internet, which has been revealed the NSA has done. But I spent a lot of time looking at the specific serial numbers referenced in these leaks, hoping it would give some sort of insight to the source. Then, after hours, I found out that basically all this information had been published online years ago. But NSA reports all have serial numbers, and they're broken down into 3 parts. First, a classification level from 1 to 3 for confidential, secret, and top secret. It also might have a letter or even 2 letters denoting the different types of classifications and restrictions on what countries it can be shared with. After that, the PDDG, which is a 2-letter or number code indicating the specific facility or program or other country that collected it. Then finally, a 1-up annual number followed by the year. These all seem to start with a 1, sometimes other numbers, and are sequential for each year. And that actually gives you some insight into how many NSA reports are produced, which from the documents appears to be roughly 10,000 a month. But all that to say, I wasted my time to find out what the serial numbers meant when later on I found out it was public knowledge via a FOIA request, but also that the leaks verified that some of the information came from these SIGINT satellites, likely those Mentor-class satellites. Also, the US has another SIGINT class called NOS, and those are typically used for detecting ships at sea. Then finally, the most interesting, imaging satellites. The US has actually declassified a lot of old spy satellite imagery that's a lot of fun to look at. In total, nearly 1 million photographs have been released. And these aren't just normal images, they're massive. This digitized photo here, for example, consists of 6.5 billion pixels. It would take almost 800 4K monitors to show the whole thing. But these early satellites showed a steady improvement in capability. One interesting note in the USGS report is that you'll notice they mention keyhole, or KH1, then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then KH9. They skip KH8. This is likely due to KH8, or Gambit, being the highest resolution satellite of the era. The exact mention of the resolution isn't anywhere to be found, except in a single declassified history of Gambit where it mentions better than 4 inches, or 10 centimeters. The weird thing is, if you go look at this document today on the NRO's website, they actually went back and redacted this part. Only through the Wayback Machine can you actually see the original. But better than 10 centimeters is about the limit possible due to atmospheric distortion. And from Trump's tweeted image, it's about the same as they can achieve today. As for today, the US really doesn't have many optical imaging satellites. There's likely only 5 or 6 KH-11s remaining. There could be others, as some of the NRO launches are not listed as to what they are, but the US seems to not really know what they want to do with imaging satellites, and every time they have a replacement program, it seems just to have cost overruns and gets cancelled. So they've just kept building more KH-11s, which have been launched since the 70s, although with improvements. But even those are reportedly costing more than it costs for an aircraft carrier at several $1 billion each. One attempt for the next generation was the Enhanced Imaging System, and these were designed to be stealthy. Stealth satellites have 2 major advantages. The fact that they're harder to detect and track both visually and by radar means that an enemy can't predict when it will fly over to photograph them. Also, it can protect them from anti-satellite weapons. If the enemy doesn't know where it is, then they can't shoot it down or attempt to blind or jam it. The US has a long history with stealth satellites. There's been patents issued going back to the early 60s. Real research began in the 70s, and in the early 1980s, President Reagan established a secret stealth satellite program. The first satellite, called Misty, was finally launched on the 28th of February 1990. Almost immediately, the Soviet Union and the media began reporting that the satellite had failed and burned up while re-entering the atmosphere. However, an application for a patent titled Satellite Signature Suppression Shield was filed just 2 weeks later, and drew attention to the project and jeopardizing its security. 7 months later, amateur space enthusiasts and observers detected it. Apparently, its optical stealth feature was only active when it was passing over Russian tracking stations. Its operators apparently didn't take into account that there would be a few hobbyists elsewhere across the world looking for it and finding it. Later, a second Misty was launched, which was the beginning of the enhanced imaging system I mentioned earlier. Then, not long ago, we had the same story play out almost exactly the same way, which I made a video on back in 2018. At the time, it was the newest, extremely expensive national reconnaissance satellite called Zuma. It was launched in January and can be watched on SpaceX's livestream. The stream, however, cut short before the fairings separated, since it was a classified satellite. And, just as with Misty, the media almost immediately began reporting that the satellite had failed and burned up re-entering the atmosphere. So it is possible, although unlikely, that this is yet another stealth satellite and it never actually failed. So you might wonder, why aren't all spy satellites stealthy? Given the increased focus on anti-satellite weapons by China, Russia, India, and others in recent years, wouldn't it be a huge advantage to keep these multi-billion-dollar satellites safe? Stealth is, after all, the trend with aircraft and even ship designs lately. Well, there's a few reasons for that. One is that radars and other tracking methods have gotten so much better, and unlike ships or aircraft, satellites have minimal ability to maneuver. So once they're detected, the enemy will likely always know where it is and be able to track it, making any stealth features kinda pointless. Also, having so many invisible satellites in orbit without their orbital parameters known is inherently dangerous. The famous Kessler syndrome is the potential domino effect, where satellite collisions create more space debris, which increases the chance of other collisions, creating more space debris, and on until low Earth orbit is nearly impossible to use. SpaceX's Starlink satellites alone made some 25,000 collision avoidance maneuvers in just a 6-month period. So, if you have a bunch of hidden, undetectable, and unregistered satellites, it's kinda hard to avoid collisions. Instead, the focus has shifted from a few large, highly capable, but extremely expensive spy satellites to many smaller, less capable, but much more affordable ones. Companies like Planet have dozens of half-meter resolution satellites, and US intelligence agencies have contracts with many of these commercial providers. More satellites also mitigates the risk of anti-satellite weapons by greatly increasing the number of targets. Half-meter resolution is much lower than what we know modern US spy satellites are capable of, but typically it's good enough for most purposes, such as what I do when I count tanks. Also, the large number more than makes up for the resolution with more coverage. All the commercial satellites together can photograph virtually any spot on Earth multiple times per day, whereas legacy spy satellites might only pass over the same target once a week. And then finally, the latest trend might be utilizing what is called very low Earth orbit. A US company called Redwire recently announced their new SaberSat. The massive benefit of very low Earth orbit is that you're much closer to Earth, enabling cameras to get much higher resolution. For example, a camera on board a satellite at just 150 km orbit would be able to achieve 16 times the resolution as the same camera at 600 km above Earth. It'd also be extremely useful for communications, as it would require less powerful transmissions and shorter latency. The reason this very low Earth orbit hasn't been used much is the high atmospheric drag. There's atmospheric drag at virtually every altitude, however, it's exponentially greater the lower the orbit. A satellite in low Earth orbit might take years, or even decades, before the effects finally pull it back down to Earth and re-enter, whereas very low Earth orbit, it might just be a matter of days. To counter this, SaberSat is actually designed to be aerodynamic, similar to an aircraft. They're also going to take advantage of newer and cheaper electronic propulsion like hull thrusters to enable it to stay in orbit for longer. Another major advantage of such a low orbit is that it would make anti-satellite weapons less effective. And this is one of the reasons that makes hypersonic glide weapons so difficult to defend against. It's just a tricky region for even missile defenses to handle. It's too high above the atmosphere, where things like Patriot and THAAD are designed to handle, and potentially too low for many exoatmospheric weapons like SM-3 and GBI to be effective. So, in the end, the US government has some pretty incredible capabilities in space, well beyond any other country on Earth, the only exception being China, who is quickly catching up. Maybe I can dig into China's capabilities in a future video. And again, thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to download it and play it for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox. Just use my link down in the description or the pinned comment. Again, new and returning players who haven't played in 6 months will also receive that massive bonus pack, including multiple premium vehicles and other goodies. But only available for a limited time, so make sure you don't miss out.